Hi everybody, I'm Sari Madi. I'm a PhD candidate in the School of Industrial Relations at the University of Montreal, and I work under the supervision of Professor Umut Ozkan. I changed the title of my presentation a little bit, so I'll be presenting the experimentation and re-regulation, the cases of the labor code and the social pact in Tunisia. I'll go through those points during the next minutes. A little bit of introduction and contextualization of my research. This is a chapter of my thesis. Actually, basically, I work on labor laws in the Middle East and North Africa, and I'm doing a comparison between Tunisia and Lebanon. For this presentation, I'll be focusing on Tunisia. I did a research trip last year to do interviews with social actors there for 3 months, and I'll be presenting also initial observations, analysis of those interviews. So basically, I'm working on the institutional change in the in developing countries, and I'm taking both cases, Tunisia and Lebanon, as two examples from the Middle East. Basically, actually, the development models after the Second World War lasted until the 1980s, and after the oil crisis, the debt crisis, and the collapse of the Soviet Union, and also under the influence of the so-called Washington Consensus, there was a shift in the political vision of the social protection, and reforms were initiated in the developing countries, including Lebanon and Tunisia. But the starting point is that the extent and the direction of those reforms varies from one country to another. So basically, I went to Tunisia to study the reforms of the labor code in the during the 19s, and then I found that the social actors there negotiated a social pact in 2012. So I added another dimension to the thesis concerning another institutional experimentation, which is the social pacts in 2012. So I'll go through the key concepts of my study first. I constructed my model on the welfare, the concept of the welfare state. Actually, after the Second World War, there was the thesis of the convergence of the national models to one model, the pluralist American model, and then this thesis was criticized by the divergence model, where we argued that the answers, the responses to the industrialization will be different according to national institutions. So in this thesis of the diversions, there is the concept of the welfare state regime, where the models of social security are also different from one country to another, and they are the results of different historical and political developments based on the work of Espen Andersen. So this literature was based on the developed countries. There was a broadening of this field of study in two directions. One toward the labor market, where there was the theories mentioning criticizing the model of Espen Andersen, and focusing on the production regime, the organization of the economy, like Hall and Suskes, and also Hagar and Kaufman, which concentrates on the developing countries. The other one is the mixed welfare economy, which add dimensions to the study of the welfare regime. But in this study, I will be focusing on the legal forms of the state. So I'm not taking into consideration the second dimension or the second path. Also, not just the social security, like state intervene in the labor market, not just through social security, but also through labor code. So I'm going to analyze the labor code from this point of view. So the second key concept is the flexicurity, based on the famous debate between regulation and deregulation since the 1980s, which was the debate was considered as closely conceptualized this two concepts, and there was the third strategy in Europe seeking the right balance between flexibility and security, the flexicurity. The basic, actually there is different models of flexicurity, but the basic form is the static flexicurity. This is based on the flexible labor market with a generous social security system and active policies. So this concept will be useful to demonstrate the degree of social protection provided by the labor code in Tunisia. Also, when I went to Tunisia, I discovered that there was always the reforms there so policies there are reformed by a tripartite committee based on a corporate arrangements. So there is a corporatism in Tunisia between the three actually actors. Quickly, just to say that the first wave of social pacts during the 1970s was based on was found in corporate countries where we have interest representation based on limited number of corporations, hierarchical order, and the official recognition of the state. The second wave during the 1990s of social pacts were found in different countries without those elements of hierarchical order or recognition by the state, on different contexts. So I'm mobilizing this concept too to the study of my case. So before going to to the labor code and the social pact, a quick national contextualization about Tunisia. So it was a French protectorate until 1956. And during this period, there was the French government imported social laws from France to Tunisia, basically to encourage the French people to go there and to work in Tunisia. So even before the independence in 1956, there was social policies and employment policies in limited, but it existed in Tunisia. So after the independence in 1956, there is two big phases or differences. During the first years of independence, there is this term Tunisification of the economy, where under the President Bourguiba, there was a corporatist or socialist prime minister who tried to socialize the economy, and the industrialization strategy used during this period was the import substitution industrialization, which failed at the end of the 1960s, and the whole model was replaced by another strategy which based on the liberalization of the economy and the development of experts in the field of textile, clothing, and leather. So during this period, the law of 1972, which changed the industrialization of the country, was promoted to push toward export substitution industrialization. So the labor code was promulgated in 1966 during the corporate period or the socialist period of Tunisia, and it was reformed in 1994 and 1996, 2 rounds of reforms. I did this table to summarize the big components of those 2 reforms. So during the first round in 1994, basically they try to simplify the representation, the workers' representation in the establishment, in the enterprise. So instead of having 3 committees of representation of workers inside, we have now just one, and we cut a lot from the power of this institution. There was also the reform went through the external flexibility of labor law in Tunisia. For example, there is the fixed term contract, and also more flexibility in hiring and in firing. And the third element was the internal flexibility, where we introduced, for example, the half day of rest instead of a whole day, and functional flexibility. After the revolution of 2011, there was another experimentation, which was the social contract, was signed by the same tripartite arrangement, a committee, the Central Trade Union, the Université, and the Ithica, the employer organization, and the government. And concerning the social policies and employment policies, they talked about introducing the employment insurance, and also to reform the social policies according to the principles of universality. So based on this literature and these observations, my research questions are those 3 questions. I'm trying to understand how the reforms initiated a path-shifting change in Tunisia, basically, and what were the factors that influenced those reforms, the dynamics and the process of those reforms, and finally the role played by institutional structure of decision making, which is the corporatism in Tunisia. So initial observations: the labor code was reformed during a context of economic liberalization. There was an agreement with the International Monetary Fund in '86 to structural adjustments of the economy in Tunisia. There was the partnership with Europe in 1996. Also, it was reformed under the authoritarian regime of Ben Ali, who controlled Tunisia until 2011. So the big questions, I'm trying to understand if the labor code went through for more flexibility, or there was also security or flexicurity. So there is both elements. It's right that there was lots of flexibility, but also, for example, the union refused, for example, to legalize the private employment agency and maintain the control commission over the economic dismissals. There is also different, from another sides, there is flexibility. For the social pact, actually the context was the ILO was organizing the meetings, and the representative was there as an observer. Also, it was the initiative of the union, the IGTT, they proposed this contract, and they pushed to the signature of this contract. So the transition democracy in Tunisia actually opened up the space for a new institutional experimentation, which is the social pact. Until now, the social pacts quickly is formed about 5 axes, and until now there is just one axe which was implemented. It's the institutionalized of the National Dialogue Council since 2017, and they still waiting for another the introducing of another elements of this social pacts. So to summarize, actually, the determinants of those reforms, I'm trying to understand the effect of the partnership with the European Union, the legacy of the labor market regulation, and the democratic context in Tunisia after 2011, among others. So that's it.
Great. Thank you.